Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Scarpa. I'm a managing director with KPMG. And up until a few weeks ago, I had the good fortune of leading the digital assets practice. Now I'm being forced to answer questions about long-term viability and all the things that come with it. Today I'm leading a really great panel of people who work in the space, are going to have some really good opinions. And we want to talk about the legal and regulatory developments and how important they are in light of what's just happened. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some questions. So please begin.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Triano. I'm the director of crypto risk at CipherTrace. I recently joined CipherTrace. I had spent the prior 10 years with the Federal Reserve, both in San Francisco and Kansas City. Please don't ask me about lawsuits because I will run out the back door. Also worked for 2 regional banks as well, and delighted to be here today.
Sean.
Good afternoon. Sean Joyce. I'm founder and CEO of Atlas Crossing, a public affairs firm in Washington, D.C. Spent the past 15 years in D.C., worked on Capitol Hill in a number of capacities, most recently as Patrick McHenry's chief of staff, who's the ranking member of Financial Services Committee. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. This is Rajat Jain, and I'm Vice President Fund Accounting Department, now Fundraising Group. And I'm one of the relationship managers, and I'm working with DAP for more than 12 years now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Morsfield, and I'm the Global Head of Accounting Solutions for LUKKA. LUKKA is a institutional grade software and data company specific to the crypto asset industry. And one of the things we do, which I'll talk about later, and try to keep everyone's interest, because it's accounting, is accounting and tax compliance, among many other things for this space. So I'm happy to be here. My background, very quickly, is I've been around this space for a very long time, and I mention that only because as I answer questions, I'll have some of my different hats on, and sometimes all the hats on at once, but everything from in academia here at most of the universities in the city to a Big Four auditor to buy side and sell side here in the city, and a staff person at the International Accounting Standards Board. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much. Obviously in March, we had a very important executive order issued by the president that probably culminated from his work with the president's working group on digital assets. And now we have a very interesting bill out of the Senate. I'm not sure the status of that bill or how much of it we'll get through, but it's good to see the lawmakers in Washington finally coming around to the prospects of digital currency being part of our daily lives. Sean, I want to start with you. Opinions as to the relevance of the bill, what aspects may get through, what Mr. Gensler said yesterday, which he seems in one hand to say, we want Congress to be involved, and then when Congress gets involved, he doesn't like what Congress has to say.
Right.
So interested in your thoughts on all of that.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Going back to the president's working group, that stemmed from Reagan authorities. It's been around for years. The executive orders were a good step in the right direction. From my perspective, I think it's a breadcrumb trail they're trying to leave from the administration, right? It's glorified studies, and that's a good thing. You need to study this more, because when you come to Washington, if you talk to your members of Congress, all 535 members, you will find that the vast majority of them don't know much about this space at all. The 10 or 15 that do can maybe talk about the underlying blockchain technology, but the other 500 so, you don't want them writing cryptocurrency policy today. That's just the fact of the matter, because they probably would get it wrong, and that's okay. The legislation that was dropped 2 weeks ago is the effort should be commended by Gillibrand and Lummis. Senator Lummis have been working on this for several months. This is actually how you want policy to be written. Not in the dead of night, not a bill that gets dropped into a leadership written package that gets jammed onto a must-pass spending bill, and then everyone in industry says, how the hell did that happen? You want to have a process. And so the process was, they put the bat signal up last fall. You all recall the infrastructure bill when they were trying to define broker-dealers. And then everyone in this industry, I think, realized that nobody in DC knew what they were talking about in this space. And so Lummis did the right thing. She said, okay, come and talk to me about it. And she solicited input and advice. And people from all over industry came in and talked, and we worked really closely with her team for several months. They stood up working groups, task forces, did a hearing on it. And then fortunately, Senator Gillibrand came to the table a few months ago, and we worked with her as well. She had some really good additions that Wellness's team hadn't really been looking at in the beginning, and put together what finally was a bipartisan product. And that right there just changes the game. If this was a partisan bill, this would have gone nowhere. So the fact that you have a bipartisan bill by two serious senior senators, it's a big deal, and they should definitely be commended. To the direct question of passage and what happens, I saw their interviews right immediately afterwards, and the day after the introduction, they were talking about being passed in 100 days. I think that's a little bit ambitious, but you've got to be ambitious when you want to get things done. Congress obviously has a very tall order on their plate right now, where there's main existential issues going on. We've got gun control debate going on. We've got Build Back Better happening. There's crazy inflation, supply chain issues. But what's going to happen is these bills are going to go through the committee process. That bill in particular, which does not have a House companion yet, has to get referred to 4 different committees: Senate Banking, Senate Finance, Judiciary, and the Intelligence Committee to do the cybersecurity components. And so that takes time to get those bills through there, to read up their colleagues, and to have them understand what this actually means. So at the end of the day, it's really good progress. Does it happen this year? I don't want to handicap that it would, but I think it's a marker being set up for you all to come and say, hey, I like this provision. This helps me, or maybe you guys didn't interpret this the right way. Can we tweak this? And that's what this process is. It's putting out another bat signal for people to come and say and offer their suggestions and feedback so that next Congress, when they reintroduce it, perhaps it goes.
Rob, as former Federal Reserve in 2 different banks, do you think this bill, had it been passed last year, might have prevented what we're seeing now?
That's a good question. Maybe yes, maybe no, is the immediate way to react to it. I'm not surprised that it's Wyoming and New York coming to the table, just given the fact that they have, from a state perspective, the most infrastructure in place. I think people are starting to finally maybe see what Wyoming was onto 3 or 4 years ago, and how sensible a lot of the statutes were. So I will say that, right? The sources of that bill make sense to me, and there are a lot of sensible things in there.
Gotcha. Do you feel that the Federal Reserve was left out, though, in that bill? Because I personally think macroprudential regulation at this point might have prevented a lot of the issues that we're now dealing with. Yep. Do you think the Fed should have featured more prominently in that bill?
Outside of the fact that they were put on the spot for how they issue master accounts, right, in the bill. Yeah, I think there certainly could have been a little bit more involvement, but there's a lot of things the federal banking agencies are working on right now together anyways.
Excellent. Do you feel like the lack of a regulatory framework has affected the innovation and the offerings in the space?
To some extent, yes. I think we heard that from a couple of the prior panels today. Right, there's that need for regulation, so you know how to operate, so you don't run afoul. Right, that's the simplest way of putting it. But at the same time, maybe some innovation has actually happened because people were a little bit more free to act. Right.
Well, maybe a little too free.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
Rajat, interesting question for you about the executive order and where you see the biggest impacts of that executive order. What are you particularly looking forward to within the executive order's mandates?
Yeah, definitely that executive order has many impact, and it touches many areas of this space. This executive order recognizes that this very important factor of economy, this digital assets, and also recognize that there may not be adequate regulation to this space. And as a service provider, as an administrator, we feel that every day, and we are actually processing the transaction every day. We are doing AML KYC, we are doing valuation or some of the custody issues. So we feel that when you go, there are regulations out there are things, but when you do an actual work or nitty-gritty, you feel that there are some clarification which will be needed. There may be more FAQ which are needed. So all of these are very important, that this executive order may bring different regulatory bodies to work together and come up with the regulatory framework which we are all looking for. So some of the example, like while processing ML KYC, source of fund is the biggest question. Like when somebody is funding the subscription through wallet, meaning how you tie back to the investor. That is like something which guidance are needed. While doing tax accounting, there are many scenarios like straddle issues, wash sale, where we feel that there are not enough clarification and guidance which are required. So all of these areas, this executive order will definitely going to help us. And also this order talks about investor protection. So and the custody of assets is always a discussion with SEC. So many fund manager we deal with is still doing like a self-custody of asset, which is of course one of the investor protection factor there. So there's a guidance needed in that area as well. Apart from that, we also feel like what Sean said, like while making these regulations, there needs to be industry participant required, like there's a working group or roundtables or feedback. Otherwise, once these regulations are out and if it is not practical to follow, then we are at the same stage. While confusion is there, delay in reporting is there. So I think this is a step towards the right direction, as Sean said. And increased regulation may bring, as a downside, may bring more operational cost, more kind of work or more people hiring, but in a longer term, I think it will work out well when everybody has a consistent policy and a framework under they can work.
That's good to hear. I wanted to avoid this as long as possible, not being an accountant and not really understanding.
That's why I sat all the way through.
That's why I wanted to go to you at the end. I only tangentially touch tax issues, and they're not my forte. So I understand the Loomis bill has some tax components to it. I understand the FASB has weighed in. I understand AICPA has some opinions. Suzanne, what is the state of play right now with regard to digital assets and taxation? And are we going to get some clarity so we understand exactly how to pay taxes, file, report, et cetera?
So one of the things, and I learned this from, we have a wonderful colleague at LUKKA, Olya Roundup, who is our director of tax solutions, so I learned a lot from her. One of the things we convey, and number one, we don't give tax or accounting advice. I should quickly put that out on the table. So this isn't any advice. Please check your tax and accounting advisor. But just because things aren't very specifically delineated out across the board for all kind of crypto transactions and crypto assets doesn't mean there aren't rules and there aren't underlying principles and guidance that we can refer to. So we have some of that really in place that we rely on and that you can take to your tax advisor and say, here's a position that seems reasonable based on the existing guidance. There's little places where there's something more specific, but there's a framework at least to start with. Although, for instance, in the Gillibrand bill, there's some interesting developments along, and it's been touched on earlier panels, the de minimis sort of kind of spend of cryptocurrency or crypto assets on things and sort of avoiding some of the current reporting sort of requirements for things that are small. There's some possible new features for broker dealers and opportunities to get mark-to-market accounting under tax or mark-to-market treatment. I went to my accounting hat. I'll take that off for a second. And so there's some developments that could be really, really useful to a variety of folks. On the accounting side, it gets really interesting really fast, but not that it's not interesting to tax lawyer. Let me make sure I'm very clear there. Because we have this situation, and it plays out with the recent SEC proposal that I think you may get to in a second, or SEC Staff Accounting Bulletin. The FASB has decided to do a project. The AICPA is in the mix. And what we've got right now is underlying accounting rules, same kind of notion as tax. We have rules that we can rely on, but are they really fit for purpose is one of the things that comes up. And so there is what we call non-authoritative guidance, which looks at the authoritative rules, which the FASB puts out, and the SEC can put an additional regulatory layer on top. That's authoritative. And then non-authoritative, which can help interpret where we're at. And This touches on, something everybody in the panel, I think, has said in one way, shape, or form, is that process matters when it comes to rules and regulations of all sorts, whether it's coming from the federal government, whether it's coming from Accounting Standards Board, whether it's coming from the Treasury for taxes. Process really matters and can make a big difference. And so one of the things in the accounting space, if you're going the authoritative guidance route, and I know this touches on some of the other policies and regulations, there is a due process, there is full transparency, there's public deliberations and discussion, there's public feedback loops where we get to make comments, where the industry is really brought to the table, as some of my colleagues have said. And so when we're in the authoritative deciding space, which is what the FASB has just sort of said, we're going to enter into this space and develop authoritative guidance. When we're in that space, there's so much more sunlight on the whole process and more opportunities for all of us in the room, in Global DCA, all of us to be engaged. And then you often get, not always, but you often get regulations, rules that are well-informed, that are transparent, that are proportional, that don't stifle innovation by accident. And I think that's sort of maybe where I'll leave it for now.
And that was really helpful, and I think you distilled it pretty nicely for someone who does not speak tax, so I appreciate that. Sean, question for you. We've spent a lot of time with the FSOC explaining that crypto is a systemic risk to the financial system. Is it safe to say that the recent events would indicate that's actually contrary to the narrative of the FSOC, that in fact crypto really isn't systemic? Maybe in its own right, it has an issue for the participants in that industry, but is it something that the banking regulators should be concerned about as it relates to their primary regulated entities?
That's a good question. I kind of want to go back to your comment about Gensler's reaction earlier this week, because I think it kind of touches on that. I mean, first of all, I was most appreciative of the fact that he actually spelled out the word steak when talking about proof of stake to make sure we didn't understand he was talking about a cut of meat. If you watched the interview yesterday, he actually does that. But you have to separate signal from noise in this space, right? There are things that he is saying and there's things that they are actually doing. Yesterday, he said that he doesn't need additional authorities, but he doesn't really like what Congress is kind of jamming down his throat. He also relayed that there is urgency, and there's been continued urgency. That was his word he used, continued urgency. This isn't something that's just popping up in the past couple of weeks. And that's kind of the posture he's taken all along. Some might say, I didn't say, but some might say he's taken a hostile tone towards industry. But you look at what they've been able to actually do from a regulatory authority. Hester Pierce even talks about this. The authority has been through enforcement, and that's primarily how they've used it, right? If he had additional authorities, I think they probably would have used them in the first 100 days of the new Congress. And so what's happened, if you see his comments 3 weeks ago when he testified at the House Appropriations Committee on the congressional budget, he talks about the fact that he probably has authority to have oversight over the majority of the 19,500 cryptocurrencies, but not Bitcoin. That's the first time he's ever been pinned down, ever, if you look at his public comments saying something like that. Probably is a really big word for Mr. Gensler. The Gillibrand Lummis bill being dropped, though, you see a little bit shift in tone, and I think one of the reasons you see that is because everyone realizes November is around the corner. What happens when the midterms come around is there's a very high likelihood Republicans take not only the House but the Senate, in which case he's going to have new masters who have oversight over his agency. Republicans, when they take over, they're going to be wholly focused on oversight. They're going to be subpoenaing him, his entire team. He built up the team. They now have 50 full-time staff on the crypto team. They're doing that because they are preparing to dig in and to not to be hyperbolistic, but go to war almost. And so I think Congress is going to have to take an aggressive approach. The good news today, as we say this, is the fact that industry has actually come together and built champions out. And so yes, there's maybe only 15 members that can really get into the weeds of the policy with you, but there's another 50 to 70 who aren't scared or who run the other direction when you come to their office and say the word cryptocurrency. And yes, Congress is filled full of septuagenarians, and sometimes when they see people at a crypto conference with purple hair, they go the other way. But keep it up. You have to keep going. You have to educate them and not make this a scary thing and make Web 3.0 something that they all want to embrace. And so I think being able to lean in on that, lean in with your representatives, is going to be the best enforcement and shield against the agencies.
That makes perfect sense. And Suzanne, now that things have happened and have rolled out recently, there's going to be a lot of acquisitions because there really is a lot of great technology out there. There are a lot of great companies and service providers in the space. I was at Consensus last week. I saw all of them. It was really fantastic. When you're going to be acquiring those types of entities, let's say you're a traditional financial institution trying to get some of the benefits of the blockchain, for instance, what are the things you would look to and look at before acquisition of these companies?
I think, I'll defer to some of my panelists too who might do this more day to day, but a really important thing, and it came up, and I'll just borrow it from David Mercer, is look for the businesses that are for all seasons. That is a really important thing you want to look for, or that helps your own business become more of a business for all seasons if you're not. So that's a really key thing. I think it possibly is way up the list. And then obviously one of the things that's come up over and over today, and it's something where we're all thinking about more and more, is just risk and understanding the risk contained in the potential acquisition and how it maps with what's already contained in yours. And are you accidentally exacerbating it, or are you helping sort of hedge it, if you will, almost? And those are just a couple of things that I would think about, but also defer to some of my colleagues too.
Rob, what about yourself? What kind of thoughts do you have around acquisitions of these companies now that you see a little bit more of what's under the hood?
Sure. So CipherTrace, acquired by MasterCard 7 months ago, right? So kind of going through that right now and seeing a little bit from I guess that perspective, right? And I always go back to most of my career is in traditional finance and banking, regulatory, and working for two banks, and thinking about how solid some of the regulatory framework is around merger and acquisition due diligence, third-party risk management, vendor due diligence, right? You could pull from probably 15 different things that could apply to a non-traditional financial institution. And those things have been around for a really long time. What to avoid, what to focus on, and how to get full efficacy out of an acquisition.
A question for the entire panel. I find in working with these companies, not all of them, but a lot of them, the maturity and the understanding really isn't there, and they push back a little bit on the prudential regulatory rails that have been put in place for other financial institutions. Do we feel like for the ones who come through this, there will be more of a willingness to adopt some of the strategies of traditional finance? Whoever wants to answer can answer.
Yeah, I can take that question. So, definitely there will be, when you're switching or transitioning from traditional to more blocks, there's some learning curve, of course, to that effect. And but you got to understand the space better before, while you are transitioning it. If you always wear the traditional hat and not able to, go to what this asset class actually offers, then it's going to be always difficult for the people. So I think you have to understand what nuances, what underlying characteristic of the asset class is, and kind of build from there.
That sounds great. Thanks, Rajat, for that. I find that not all of the oversight and supervisory guidance is necessary, but I feel as though when you pick it, instead of the regulator picking it, you actually do a lot better. It actually is more fit for purpose. It's actually somewhat less expensive in terms of integrating, so I think that's something of a message for the community. Sean, do you think that the current environment, the current volatility, is going to shape what happens to the ultimate bill that Loomis and Gillibrand put forth?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in a hyper-partisan environment that we are looking at in Congress across the country, it is difficult to find compromise. Gone are the days where Reagan made it famous, the 80-20 rule, right? Compromise is now a 4-letter word. If you're in the middle 80% of the Republican or Democratic Party, you are accused of gone DC and selling out. And so you've got both sides who are hyper-partisan right now. There needs to be a reset in order to get grand deals done again. I don't think you're going to have that kind of reset before the midterm elections, unfortunately. But given the fact that there is likely to be a Republican Congress and Democratic administration, it gives Biden a really interesting opportunity for him to kind of step up for what he was intended to do as president, which is have this Clinton-esque opportunity to work with the body that he just came from and cut deals. And so I think that's probably the best opportunity for the Lummis-Gillibrand bill. But again, there's a short window because, like all things, politics is very fickle, and by the time we're in this time next year, everyone in Congress is going to be looking at 2024, and presidential nominees are going to start coming up. So they've got to, act now. Like, don't wait until next year. Go and talk to people. Look at the bill. It's 79 pages. Figure out what works for you and your companies, and go and talk to your members of Congress today. And also tell them what they did right, because most people don't go to their congressman and tell them you're doing a good job. Everyone usually goes to yell at them. So if you can say, we like page 14, subsection A, like, do that, but then, hey, maybe think about tweaking it this way, and go there collectively. Go there with a sane argument and be willing to engage and educate would be my best advice.
I mean, I was personally impressed that it was under 80 pages,
Right.
considering how Congress acts.
Right.
A couple things that I've always found fascinating was Congress agrees on nothing, yet the Senate has always kind of agreed that digital assets are a thing and we need to take care of them. Now I'm reading that 91% of America is going to still purchase digital assets, even despite what is happening. I mean, isn't that incredible that we have this interest, despite the fact that people are getting taken to the cleaners right now if you're holding a lot of these assets? What are your thoughts? I mean, do you see this as an area of unification within the Congress and within the agencies? Or is it Gensler versus the CFTC and we hope someone wins? Like, what do you think, Rob?
Well, I guess it kind of brings up a thought, bringing the executive order back into play, right? I think if you go to print it, it's about 38 or 39 pages. If you take out the agencies' names, right, it probably goes down to about 20 pages, which maybe that's kind of my thought or reaction to the question is how are all of these agencies going to cooperate, work together, and get to a viable end solution? So as popular as this may be to the public, and they're going to engage with it one way or another, and the Senate could even be moving in one direction, right? But how are you going to get, 20-something agencies to cooperate, and then you bring in the however many state agencies into the fold, and I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges of the whole thing.
Well, the state agencies would be welcome. In my experience, the state agencies have done a lot more to advance crypto than the federal government has, just by basis of the licenses that they give out in the various states. You mentioned Wyoming, New York with the BIT license, limited purpose trust. I feel like the federal agencies would be best served by going to a lot of the state regulators, because they have been dealing with this longer than the Federal Reserve and other agencies have. The other thing is, Celsius was under major either consent orders or findings from 5 states, I believe, before all of this meltdown occurred. Where was Mr. Gensler? How did he miss that? These are just questions I have, because he's been so sharp in this industry, but why are the states leading the charge when this is really something that the federal government should be leading? Sorry for my soapbox. Suzanne.
Well, I had just a thought came into my mind about, sort of slightly tweaking the question to the difference between perhaps a retail sort of investor and the institutional one.
Yeah.
And so we see, for instance, steady growth for LUKKA with our institutional folks, and at the same time, we all also know some like financial institutions are staying on the sidelines. So I think it might depend a little bit on the audience.
Do you think, though, that now you're going to get the large institutions who have maybe steered away from this industry to jump in just based on the fact that there are probably deals to be had?
Yeah, possibly. I think some of them are a little concerned about, depending on the type of institution, prudential regulatory reaction to some of the things, waiting for clarity, all of that. But perhaps.
That makes perfect sense. Most promising aspects of either the new bill or the executive order that you wanted to highlight relative to what you do? Panel question.
I'll start at that end.
Rob, anything?
Sure. So obviously I work for a blockchain analytics firm now, and a lot of the stuff to do with illicit finance and mitigating fraud and money laundering and sanctions evasion, right? That's the most promising piece for us, is for that to be a fairly prominent portion of the executive order. So stop there quick. I know we're almost at time. So.
I'll just say I think the fact that it merely exists. It took long enough to get here, and there's now a product, and that gives everyone the opportunity to come in and continue working that through the process.
Yeah, I would just say that step in the right direction.
And I'll disagree with everyone else.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Thank you, panel. This was fantastic. I learned a lot, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Mike.